Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. Thank you for coming out this evening. It's always a great delight to actually think that people are prepared to come out and listen to what we've got to say. We are online tonight, and I've been given 2 lines that I'm not allowed to go outside, and I've been told that if I go outside them, there's a shock that's going to come through the speaker. So if you suddenly see me shake a little bit, it's just because they've shocked me because I've gone outside of shot. So tonight, when we kind of decide who's going to talk on these presentations, you've got to be really, really quick. And we were kind of talking in the office as to who was going to talk and do tonight's presentation. And I was obviously too slow because both Willie and Michael, who obviously knew that there was a war coming in the Middle East, said, we can't do it. And here I am, I had my presentation all ready to go, and Saturday morning, Mr. Trump decides that he's going to bomb the Middle East. So hopefully, I'm not going to get into too dangerous places tonight, and certainly I can't solve the problems in the Middle East. So let's just answer the question right up front, before you have to ask it. I have no idea when the war in the Middle East is going to end. Okay, so we've done that one, that's finished. So, in essence tonight, we're going to look at the trend as your friend, exploring the big ideas impacting investing. And so let's just explore what that means. Well, the trend as your friend is a fundamental investing adage, advising market participants to align their strategies with the prevailing market direction. Buying in an uptrend and selling in a downtrend. Rocket science. That's incredible. By following the primary trend rather than fighting it, investors can significantly increase their long-term odds of success as it avoids betting against market momentum. But of course, like every good economic adage, there's a caveat. And the caveat is that the trend is your friend only until it reverses. And I can't tell you which way we're going to go. But what I thought we would do is we'd start by looking back on trends that have driven us over the last 100 years. And when we look back, we can look at the major events, and we can understand them because many of us have lived through them or are living through them. I learned some things about things that happened before my time, which were very, very interesting. But they've definitely shaped markets and how investment has been done, and certainly where returns have come from. And then I thought once we've looked back 100 years, we might look forward and see what are the big trends that we could possibly look at and identify that are really going to shape the next 100 years. Now, the beauty of this presentation is that I'm fairly confident that none of us in this room are going to be here in 100 years' time. So you can't come and tell me that I'm wrong. So I think I'm quite safe. Okay. So let's look back over the last 100 years. And I've looked at 5 major areas that have really shaped how the world has moved. So we'll start at the bottom left, medicine. Almost 100 years ago, penicillin is discovered, and there's not a person in this room that probably hasn't experienced antibiotics and what they do. We've gone right down to the polio vaccine. 1962, we had the first hip replacement. I'm not going to ask everyone in the room to put up their hand and tell me if they've had a hip replacement, but I'm pretty certain that Howick wouldn't exist if it weren't for their hip replacement. In 1967, we had the first heart transplant, and obviously we know that that's South African history. The first IVF baby in 78. In 2003, we had the successful Human Genome Project. And then obviously 2020, there was the controversial COVID vaccine. If we then move to urbanization, industrialization, and consumerism, we all understand that that has really grown amazingly. In 1958, commercial aviation really kicked off. My grandparents came out to northern Rhodesia after the Second World War. They flew out on an aeroplane. It took them 4 days, and they had an overnight stop every night. Stayed in a hotel. Can you imagine that? And now you can fly almost anywhere in the world within 24 hours. Well, not quite anywhere in the world. We're going to exclude the Middle East at this point. But pretty much you can fly anywhere else. In 1973, oil reshapes the global industry. In the 80s, deregulation and consumer market growth just exploded. And then we started to see the emergence in the 90s of the megacities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York. In the 2000s, the expansion of the global middle class. And then 2010s, we started with this thing called e-commerce. And I'm pretty certain everyone in the room has either bought something from Temu or Shein or Take-A-Lot. And so it's really part of our lives, or potentially, if you're not happy with the snacks, you can phone Checkers 6060. They might just get here before they close. And then we had the 2020s work from home, completely reshaping the dynamics of the global marketplace from there. Digital technology. So in 1947, the invention of the transistor. Then we moved on to the creation of the integrated circuit. Microprocessors. In 1973, the first mobile phone call was made. That seems like just yesterday. I'm saying that because I'm round about that vintage, and it seems like I'm still young, although my children tell me that I'm definitely not. Then we had the PC released, and in 1991, the World Wide Web became public, and we all know that's changed our lives. The first iPhone only came in 2007, 18 years ago. 2012 was deep learning, which was really the beginning of AI as we know it today, and that is really going to shape us, and we're going to look at that a little bit later. Then we look at globalization. In 1944, Bretton Woods Agreement was reached, which was really about creating economic stability after the Second World War. The dollar was pegged to gold and became the reserve currency that is probably in a bit of a fight today. We saw container shipping standardized in terms of standard size of shipping containers that move around the world and bring all our Shein and Temu goods to us. In 1973, we had the global oil crisis. We may be in the middle of another one now. Who knows? Then we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and pretty much the collapse of the Eastern Bloc countries. The World Trade Organization was formed, and in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization and really starts to grow amazingly at that point. Then 2008, we have a bit of a problem, skid in the road as we hit the global financial crisis. And then pretty much from there, we have this huge thing of global integration of networks of parts coming from everywhere and building it and just in time. And that really expands into 2015 and probably hits a little bit of bump in the road during COVID and maybe hitting a second bump in the road now. And then decolonization, something maybe that we're very, very familiar with here. In 1947, India and Pakistan get independence. In 1949, the People's Republic of China is formed. And in 1955, there was this thing called the Bandung Conference. I'd never heard of it before. But actually, that's where the non-aligned movement pretty much arose. And I had a really educated gent in politics come and tell me today that the Bandung Conference is really the inspiration for the BRICS movement of today. And then in 1960, we had the Year of Africa. Anybody know why it was called the Year of Africa? There were 13 African countries that got independence in 1960. I didn't know that, but obviously it was this movement that really started and carried on from there. We saw the USSR finally collapse in 1991. The EU was formed, and then in the 2000s we saw the rise of China into that space. And those are probably not the only events, but those are some of the key events that have really driven where we find ourselves economically and socially around the world. And they certainly have had their imprint onto global markets. The amazing thing about history is that with history, you only know what the important events are when you look back. You don't ever really know what's important and what's unimportant when you're living it or when you're looking it forward. So we sit here at the moment not really knowing what's going to happen in the Middle East. Now, it might be very easy in 6 months' time to say, but of course that would happen. But we actually can't do that, and you can find people who will argue both sides of the equation. So that's what's kind of got us to where we are. So let's maybe look and go forward. So I'm going to deal with 4 areas that I think are going to drive a major trends in the globe going forward. The first in the top right-hand corner is obviously AI. Then we're going to look at geopolitics. And I want to tell you that I actually created that slide before Trump went to war. So maybe there was something a little bit prophetic about it. Then the top left-hand corner is the age and the longevity and the impact of an aging population and how long we're all living, and some of the trends in that space and the implications. And then maybe one that's not really talked about too much, which is this breakdown, which we probably haven't had much for. And I was attacked by somebody who was from the silent generation this morning, who said, "You forgot us." And I said, "I understand, but you are the silent generation, so you shouldn't even be complaining." But anyway, it's this migration from the boomers to the Gen X to the millennials to the Gen Zs, and just some of the trends that are quite different between those various sort of sects of humanity, if we should call them, and what that really means. So let's move firstly into AI. We're all familiar with this term AI. It's probably the buzzword that we all have. Is there anyone in the room that hasn't had an experience with ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or anybody? 1, 2, 3. Not a lot. So even you guys have kind of experimented on ChatGPT and AI, but it's going to be far wider than that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a few things that are kind of projected to happen with AI and the implications into the day-to-day life. And you'll understand that the world we're going to live in the next 50 years is going to be completely different. So let's start and just have a look all the way back, and this chart goes back to the 1850s, and what it does is it looks at the amount of money relative to GDP in each year that was invested into that specific technology. So at the extreme left-hand side, we've got railroad. And I mean, I've obviously read a lot about the railroad, but I had no idea that the investment was that significant in terms of the global economy relative to everything else. If you had asked me, I would have said electricity would have probably shaded everything else. But railroad was a massive investment in there. Then we see cars. And then some of the stuff moving as we get into the 1900s, growth of e-commerce and computers and semiconductors. But the real interesting one comes at the end here with the investment into AI software. And you can see that there's the light purple line, which is what is actually being spent. And where it goes darker is what's projected to be spent in the coming decades. And we can see that this is absolutely going to dwarf any other form of technology into the future. And so as it accelerates, and one of the things that's just so incredible about AI, I mean, Willie is actually probably the expert in our office on AI, and he dragged me down a rabbit hole, and it's been really interesting looking at it. But one of the things that's so incredible is that everything starts to unlock things in other areas. So the one unlocks another across different spheres, and the momentum starts to grow. So let's have a look at medicine as a starting point. Maybe something important to the people in this room. But don't worry too much about the detail here. So don't worry about the detail. We're just going to deal with the concept. So on the extreme left-hand side, we're looking at the cost and the process to bring a drug from discovery to use in the market. So on average, the total cost is about $2.4 billion from the moment we start to do it till you can get a pill over the counter. And you go through, on average, just under 8 human trial failures. So you go through this whole process, you do a human trial, it fails, you go back to the beginning. And the time it takes to market is roughly 13 years. And that's why there's this protection for the pharmaceutical companies to sell their drug for so many years before a generic can arrive. So if we just come a little bit into the center, this is the current experience with AI within this investigation of bringing a drug to the market. And initial efforts have dropped the cost from 2.4 billion to 1.7 billion. It has halved the number of human trial failures, and it has shaved 2 years of bringing medicine to the market. Now, what that is doing is it's actually driving your medical cost inflation faster, because the amount of time that a company can recoup its investment cost is getting shorter, and as a result, they've got to put an extra cost on it, which is why inflation is growing like it is. But on the right-hand side is the projection that's coming up into the future. They're estimating that future drug design will cost less than $1 billion. So almost a quarter of the cost of what it was under the old scheme. There will only be less than 2 trial failures with that, but it'll take 8 years, full 6 years quicker than it used to be to get a drug to market. Now, when I saw this, I got very excited because I was sure that AI must know that we all want a drug that can give men's hair back. The next thing to look into is motor vehicles. So we're all aware of, to some extent, this issue around self-driving cars and Tesla. I mean, that's probably been on everyone's lips. But if you look at the left-hand chart, currently in the United States of America, if you get a ride hail, in other words, something like an Uber or a Lyft or a Bolt, it is costing you on average $2.80 per mile in order to travel in that car. Your own personal vehicle, and I see I've spelt that badly, your own personal vehicle is costing you 80 cents a kilometer. So it still makes sense to have your own car. In China right now, a human-driven ride hail is costing less, around about 50 US cents per mile to drive. When we go full robo-taxi global, estimated to be around 2035 in urban centers, the cost of that will be around about 25 cents a mile. It is estimated that right now, that the urban travel, there are 5 times too many cars in America in urban areas for the number of trips that need to be done if we have an automatic ride hail. So that's quite a terrifying thing if you work for a motor vehicle company from there. And then you go, well, maybe that's a long way away. Well, on the right-hand side, this is current mileage done. So these are the major service providers. So Waymo operates in places like Los Angeles and Las Vegas and in states of America. So you've got Waymo, Baidu, Pony AI, which all are completely autonomous driving. Waymo is doing about 350,000 miles a month of rides autonomously, no driver, A to B. The only time you actually see a human in car is with that WeRide and Tesla. There's a safety monitor present, but they're not driving the car. They're just sitting there in case. This is definitely happening. And it's definitely going to happen that probably one day we're going to drive to Joburg and play cards, not sit behind the wheel and drive. And I can almost imagine my grandchildren going, "Tell us again, Granddad, you had to steer the thing." Can you imagine? But that is definitely going to change that. So let's have a look at the roll-on impact to that in the motor vehicle industry. So this is the estimate. So there's 3 elements to self-drive vehicles. There's the technology on the left-hand side, and those are the major service providers that own the technology on the left. The middle one is obviously the automakers who have made their vehicles available, and only 2 of those actually own the technology, which is Tesla and Zoox. So Zoox actually produce a car and own the technology. And then there's the person who sources the client for the trip, which is, we're familiar with Uber, maybe Bolt, Lyft, Grab, Avis is into that, Move. Those are the major platforms in order of sourcing rides. But have a look at where the revenue is in this space. It's estimated that 76% of the revenue and 97% of the profit belongs to the organizations that own the technology that actually make the self-driving car. Look at the losers in this situation. It's the motor vehicle companies. And so this is going to shape our world, it's going to make it completely different, and how we invest and who's going to be the winners could be completely different into the future. It's got very quiet in here. Then let's have a look. I think probably one of the biggest concerns around AI is, well, everyone's going to lose their job. There's going to be no work to be done, and we're all going to be unemployed, and we're going to have a massive social crisis. So what this chart does is it looks at software versus wages on a global basis, and it tries to project over the next 3 years, based on 3 different investment patterns, what it might look like. So we've got on the extreme left-hand side that currently, globally, there is a software spend of roughly 1.43 trillion in terms of automating systems. And you can see it's a tiny sliver, and the rest is all wages. So you have to pay a human being to do whatever you need them to do. If we just look at a modest investment, roughly 10% compound annual growth, which is about $3.4 trillion, knowledge worker growth is still going to be 6.3%. So we're still going to need an increasing number of knowledge workers in order to work with AI to do that. Automation will be roughly 31% of organizations. There will be 0-hour reduction in terms of work hours, but we will unlock something like $22 trillion of surplus productivity into the marketplace through companies. That really benefits us investors who are buying the right companies. If it's an accelerated investment, sort of like the middle of the road, 37% compound annual growth, roughly $7 trillion, then knowledge worker growth is going to half, roughly 3.2%. Automation will be almost 61% of whatever a company does in producing its product, and there will be a roughly 8% reduction in hours. It's not enough for a round of golf, but it might be for a surf. I don't know. The value unlock will be round about 57 trillion in surplus in terms of productivity. If we get rapid mass adoption in this space, and we look at a 56% compound annual growth of investment, roughly $13 trillion, knowledge workers are still going to be required. There's still a growth of knowledge workers. Automation will be roughly 81% of what we do, but we'll be working 20% less hours in a day. So definitely, maybe the 9 to 5 is going to become the 10 to 3. I don't know. But that's going to have interesting, I'll pick up on this again a little bit later when I deal with one of the other aspects. But the big thing is that we are still going to have humans, and they're still going to be working. You know, one of the things that I think is probably worth saying at this point, we've kind of lived through this before. You know, the World Wide Web was this nefarious thing that really just is part of our lives today. We would never, as Harvard House, be able to run the number of clients and the amount of money that we do out of Howick if the World Wide Web had never come. Because Nigel's at the back of the room, he was there from right at the beginning. He will tell you that if you bought a share, you had to send the certificate, which was physical, up to the JSE in order for them to take your certificate. If you only, let's say you had 100 shares and you sold them, you only sold 50, they had to split it in half and send you back the certificate. Could you imagine how many backwards and forwards for the number of clients? So as a result, the World Wide Web opened the opportunity, and I'm sure that AI is going to open opportunities that we're not even aware of today for humans to add some sort of value from there. So maybe we need to be a little bit less concerned in this space. Okay, so let's move off AI and get into geopolitics. I think I could probably just leave that slide and then move on to the next subject. But let's look at that a little bit more. I think for me, this is a very, very powerful slide. It goes back to the early 2000s. And what it does is it really looks at East versus West. So the blue bars are a combination of the GDP, the gross GDP of the USA, UK, Germany, and France. And the red bars are the combination of China, India, Pakistan, and Russia. You might find Pakistan a strange one, but that is a big country that is growing exceptionally fast. And they have different values. They're not Western values, and they have a different idea about how things should work. And that really starts to tell you why we have the geopolitics that we have today. Because whoever runs the most amount of money really calls the tune. Money really does make the world go round. And monetary power is absolutely critical. And we can see there's been this, that's 25 years. It's really not that long. We can see how quickly they've gone from 10%, sub 10% in the early 2000s to coming close to 50%. Bit of a bump in the road from COVID. And that might be where Mr. Trump comes in and it gets really, really unsettled as a starting point. We've seen the rise of BRICS. So we're all aware what the gold price has done over the last little while, accelerated by what's happened in the Middle East. But there's a secular trend happening of trying to move away from the dollar as the reserve currency. And it's being driven by the BRICS countries, and you'll see that those have been the biggest buyers of gold reserves into their reserves over the last, so this is kind of over the last 3 years, what's been bought into reserves from that point of view. And that's part of why the gold price has been driven and the dollar has been under a little bit of pressure. This is a secular trend that's happening that's been driven by these guys who are trying to move away from the control of the American superpower and the dollar as the base system in the world. I think don't worry about the detail in this chart because you won't be able to read it. But in essence, as much as we're in the technological age, it's AI, it's our smartphones, it's our iPads, whatever it is, every one of those things is made out of something that they pull out of the ground. Mining is not going away anytime soon. And this might be really America's problem because if you look at the list of the minerals down the left-hand side, the role in modern technology, and I'm just highlighting EV batteries, EV storage, superconductors, solar panels, displays, photovoltaics. You might not know this, but without specific minerals, your touch screen doesn't work. And those are very, very rare elements out there. But if you have a look down the center line, the green highlighted points are every area where China either controls that mineral largely or is more than 50% of the production from mining to the marketplace. And if we look at the extreme right-hand column, that's every time you see a red area, that's where America is dependent on importing that from somewhere else. And so the Chinese have been mopping up all these things around the world and controlling the supply, and the US is finding themselves a little bit behind the 8 ball, except in one area, and that's oil. China is a net oil importer, and it's dependent on a number of countries. So we all would have experienced that Mr. Trump went and annexed Venezuela. Well, that over the last 3 years is where Venezuela's oil went. 65% of it was sold to China. And when that happened, Reuters came out with this headline and said, don't worry, Iranian oil will make up for China's loss of Venezuela's supply. That's where Iran's oil went. So I might quite cynically suggest to you that maybe war in the Middle East is less about nuclear weapons and more about slowing China down. I don't know. I mean, it's an argument that you can have. It's a very, very complex thing, but this certainly plays a big factor into the entire equation. You decide. I'm going to move on from there because I can only get myself into trouble with geopolitics, I think. So let's look at this area of the aged and getting older and this rise of aging populations. So if you look at this, this is world data. This is data that's produced by the World Bank. On the left-hand side in 1983 is a heat map that shows you the average age in every country around the world. Now, the thing you'll notice there is that large parts of the globe have an average age of 0 to 9. Now, that's pretty much Africa, South America. Your developed areas are still average age 20 to 29. If you move across to 2023, what you start to see is a lot of the more darker green coming through and the darker blue. So that's taking average age up to 40 to 49 to 60 to 69. Populations have grown. So let's just look at it a slightly different way. That's the life expectancy per area of the globe going back to 1950 right up to 2023. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, people are getting older and we're living longer. But there's another dynamic that's happening with this, and it really shows through the next chart. On the extreme left-hand side, I can't remember when it was that we did this in junior school, but at junior school we drew those graphs that kind of did population, and I remember them being the triangle of the top left-hand side. But if you look as we go 1983 to 2023, what you'll notice is that the top end has got fatter and the bottom end has actually receded. And there's this thing in economics where they look at a dependency ratio. Because in every country there's a dependence, there's people who are dependent on the working population. And now I'm going to be very careful because I don't want to tell you that you're dependent on the working population, but it's possible that you are dependent on the working population. Because if you're not working at the moment, then somebody else has got to keep the things going so that there's groceries on the counter and petrol at the pumps, etc., etc. And if we're getting less and less young people and more old people, then who's going to be the workforce? And dependency ratios have grown markedly over the last 30 years. Now, this might be the argument that says, thank goodness that AI is coming to take our jobs, because we don't have the people who are going to work in the jobs. So the one may offset each other, but this is definitely a trend. We're going to have people a lot longer with us, and they're going to be economically active for longer, and they're going to be spending money and demanding services for longer. So this is definitely a trend that is going to continue. And then interestingly, science is probably going to extend that. Because if you go back to the 40s to the 70s, it was the basic clinical markers. They checked your blood pressure, they checked your pulse, those kind of things, and they could tell you, you shouldn't do this, and you could live a little bit longer, etc., etc. But as we go, research has got to the point where they go, gee, we've got some functional markers. Grip strength is an incredible predictor of how long you're going to live. Balance is a predictor. And so you can start to work on those spaces. And so we started to see people, well, you need to get a little bit fitter, and et cetera, et cetera. Then we got right down into the DNA, and we started to look at the biological clocks and investigate that. And that informed how we lived more and more. Now we're right down to digital longevity tracking. How many people in the room own a Garmin watch or something similar, Fitbit or... Yeah, no, I mean, this is not a relatively young crowd. You should hang around with my children's lot. Man, they're comparing, how many steps they did in the last 24 hours. And I mean, it's like, that is a national sport all of its own. It's like playing cards. But we're getting right down to the point that all that data that is being collected off your watch is being stored in a central spot, and it is being researched in terms of well, let's try and track between longevity and people's activity. Discovery has now really launched this Aura Ring. So they've partnered with an organization in the States called an Aura Ring, where you don't even have to do it in a watch, you wear a ring. And the ring monitors all your basic things, and it then feeds it back, and it tells you what you should be doing. Checking your pulse ox and your heart rate and your blood pressure. I was at a restaurant the other day with a young guy, and halfway through the meal, while he was eating, he stood up. And he just started doing this. I thought, this is really weird. I said, what's going on? He says, no, my watch told me I had to move. So if you go into a restaurant and you just see a guy standing there in front of his food doing that, it's because his watch warned him he could have a heart attack if he doesn't stop. I don't think it's as bad as that. But all these things are leading through, and so we're not going to die sooner. We're actually going to live longer, because if you put AI with all this data that's happening, maybe it's not so funny that there'll be a pill for my new hair. You can see I'm quite excited about that one, yeah. Then let's look at the last one, the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. So at the moment, all these are really kind of moving in, and they're moving into the workplace, and they're really distinct because of the way the world has moved. They have very, very distinct characteristics, and they're starting to show themselves much more differentiated than any time in the past. So if we look at baby boomers, that's people born 1946 to 1964. So real apologies to anyone who was born before 1946. You are the silent generation. That's what they're known as. And it was because they didn't speak up. They just kept quiet and carried on. It's about 15. Baby boomers are about 15% of the workforce. They have a high representation in leadership in companies. They really honor loyalty, institutional knowledge, structured hierarchy preference. There's no mention of work from home with these guys, I can tell you that. It really came out of post-war growth. They wanted security of tenure, long-term employment, be safe. Their parents lived through the Depression and the First World War and just said to them, son, you got to make sure that you put food on the table. That's the most important thing. Then you had Generation X, 1965 to 1980. I fit into that category. So you've got a wide ambit there. So I could be 45 years old, but I don't think any of you would believe me. They're roughly 31% of the workforce. They're quite well diversified through senior management. They're very independent. In America, they call these the latchkey kids because they were the first generation that grew up with both parents working. So they had to let themselves in at home and feed themselves lunch and sort themselves out because their parents both worked long days. They're pretty pragmatic, and what they've shown themselves to be is pretty much a bridge between baby boomers and the millennials. Their economic volatility came there, but really the rise of personal computing. So they've seen the fax come and go. They've seen the CD disc come and go. They've really gone from using the pencil to put your tape because your tape ate your pencil, that kind of thing, to using iPhones, etc., etc. And then you get the millennials, 1981 to 1996. They're roughly 36% of the workplace. They've got a growing representation into middle management, and they are very purpose-driven. It's got to have a purpose, and profit's not a purpose. So they want to see an outcome for an organization. It must be purpose-driven. They're development-orientated. They're keen on digital workflows. They're quite keen on this flexibility, work from home, work from a coffee shop, whatever it is. And probably the millennials are part of the reason why we've seen this massive secular trend of coffee shops around the world. They lived through the global financial crisis, and that makes them, they're known as the anxious generation. And they're a little bit anxious because they don't trust anything. And particularly, they don't trust big business. And they particularly don't trust the financial system. So if you come across a millennial, there's every chance he's going to own some Bitcoin or something like that. And that's definitely coming. They've lived with rapid tech acceleration, but they did know sort of a less tech world. Unlike Generation Z, 1997, 2012, these are the guys that are really pouring into the workforce at the moment. They're only about 18%, but they're kind of coming out of university and starting their careers now. So they're not really at the top end of organizations. They're very skills focused. They are very feedback orientated, and they'll ask for it. Let me tell you, I know from experience. They're digital natives. They will work from anywhere, from their lap, from their lounge. I believe that there's rumor that at least 80% of this lot have sent an email from the toilet, but I don't know whether that's been tested. What terrifies me is how did they get that stat, but let's not go any further than that. And, they expect things to be very transparent. They want to see how things work. They've grown up in the social media era. That's how they're connected. They're not very good at face-to-face, and they're terrible at conflict. They would rather resign than have a conflict with you, which is quite challenging. So let's just have a look. Where does share of household wealth? So really, baby boomers and Generation X pretty much own more than 3/4 of the world's wealth. And so that will definitely drive how things are working. Share of labor is it's splitting more, and we're seeing a rise of the Generation Z coming in. And the millennials, baby boomers, are shrinking in terms of share of labor. And then share of consumer spending, still very, very big, but a growing millennial from that point of view. So how they spend their money and what they spend their money on is quite different. So this is a busy chart, but baby boomers, they're late career, retirement transition. So for them, financial services, investment is very important. Healthcare, those kind of things, those are big focuses from those point of view. Retirement communities, and we know that pretty well. Generation X, they're pretty coming into their peak earnings, housing, banking, education, because obviously they've got children coming through at this point, buying their bigger car, investment platforms, that kind of thing. So that's kind of driving those areas. The millennials is all about technology, fintech, childcare. So, they would love the fact that maybe they could get a robot who came and looked after their children. Imagine that, not having to pay a babysitter. And the other thing that has a massive rise in this space is they are very, very comfortable with subscription services, which has really benefited things like the rise of Netflix and those kind of things, because they're quite happy to pay a subscription in order to enjoy those things, and it's changed business. And then Generation Z, it's all about e-commerce and the creator economy. Now, you might find this really, really strange, but do yourself a favor, go and dig around and read. You and I would say that a content creator is not a job. But there are people earning stupid amounts of money who do nothing more than make a video for social media. Doing something stupid like trying to plow a field with a Ferrari. And you can laugh, but I promise you, what they're earning is making you look silly. So this is definitely, there might be implications of that to come, but it'll be interesting to see where it goes. The most interesting fact in this generational thing is that over the next 20 to 25 years, boomers will transfer $70 to $90 trillion globally to Generation X and millennials. I did this presentation in Johannesburg on Tuesday morning. I got an email from one of the attendees, and he said to me, when I saw that stat, what came to mind was that was really the preserve of the nobles and the landed gentry. This is much wider than that. It's going to be very interesting to see how this develops and how it plays out over the next 40 to 50 years, which I think will be interesting. So those are the kind of 4 trends, but now I want to look at and go, well, how not to treat a trend. So I'm going to look at a trend that kind of we all fall into when it comes to our investments, and it's probably not the best idea. And it's a modern term that you might have heard your grandparents or your children saying, but it's FOMO, the thought of feeling left behind. And, it always happens round the braai when you hear the guy who's, had R1 million in gold over the last 5 years. And you look at that and you say, gee, over the last 3 years, gold has done 16% per annum. In the last 5 years, you've done 31% per annum. And then there's this little share, NVIDIA. Now, many people this morning didn't even know who NVIDIA was, but NVIDIA is a company that made chips. And really, their target market when they got going was making chips for gamers, because they made chips that really did very, very good graphics. And guys could play these online games with each other and have the most amazing lifelike graphics. And that's where NVIDIA that was its stomping ground, until it was discovered that it had the perfect chip for AI. And then it absolutely exploded. So over the last 3 years, you've done 97% per annum out of NVIDIA, and over the last 5 years, 66% per annum. Now, the problem that we do with that is then when we see that, we take our investment portfolio and you go, imagine if I'd been all in gold or all in NVIDIA. Imagine how wealthy I would be. Well, let's not imagine. Let's actually put it on the screen. Sorry, I'm going to come back to that. That's, if I'd put R1 million into gold and NVIDIA, so the two left-hand side, I'll look at those are Harvard House portfolios. But if I'd put R1 million in NVIDIA 5 years ago, I would have had 25 million rand today. And that red line is really FOMO compared to a Harvard House portfolio. Like, jeepers, I've really lost out. What are Michael, Willie, Robin, and Nick doing in that building all day? And then, gold has been impressive, but gee, it just doesn't look at all impressive next to NVIDIA, does it? So let's just go back. And I've taken 2 examples out of existing portfolios that we have. So this is a portfolio that does draw, it's a retiree. They draw income, they draw under 4%, they're well inside the guidelines they give. They have very low exposure to the property market because of the level that they're drawing at. And you can see the dark blue line, which is the track of their portfolio going back to the beginning of 2009. This portfolio has been here longer than that, but our portfolio system that we report to you on was only implemented in 2009. We don't have the older generation stuff that I can access as easily. So over the last 5 years, this portfolio has done 11% per annum, which is in excess of where we say, so we typically will say to you, in an equity portfolio, you can expect, in a pure growth portfolio, we're not taking income, somewhere between inflation plus 4 to 6%. And you can see the numbers underneath there. Inflation plus 4% over the last 5 years would have been 8.4%. And inflation plus 6 would have been 10.4. And you can see from 2009, despite 6 years from sort of 2015, when we went through the Zoomer years and state capture and load shedding and then COVID, 6 years for the portfolio having reached a peak to then go sideways and get to that peak, he's still handsomely above that inflation plus 6. So more like a growth portfolio, even though he's enjoying income. I've got a second portfolio, and this is much more of an income portfolio. So this person stresses their portfolio significantly more. They're drawing at 5%. As a result, we have a much higher exposure to property. It's 31% to property. And you can see it's 9 years of pain for them that they've been through over that full investment cycle. At one point, in fact, during COVID and the impact into the property cycle, this portfolio was barely above inflation over that time. And yet, by sticking the course and moving through, we're actually seeing this portfolio is almost at the inflation plus 6%, and over the last 5 years has done 16% per annum investment return, despite having drawn that income. And despite having 9 years of extreme pain where they probably felt that they wanted to have lunch with Michael every day and ask him what he was doing. That is part of the investment cycle that you experience. So Imagine if we'd gone back sort of 3 and 5 years and said, okay, well, maybe I'll put 3% NVIDIA and 3% gold in the portfolio. And my figures aren't exact here because I haven't taken into account the rand movement and what have you. I've just worked with pure percentages here. But just assuming, so the dark blue section is the existing portfolio that we gave. So I've used the 3% income portfolio here. And all I've done is I've added either 3% of gold and NVIDIA or 5% of gold and NVIDIA. So now I'm certainly not this huge difference, but still relative to just if I'd had a little bit, gee, it would have made it look so much better. And it does show you, if I can pick the winner, it does make a massive difference for the portfolio. That's what it would have looked like on the graph. Not quite as bad as my previous one with NVIDIA and gold and what have you, but still maybe a little bit disappointing into my existing portfolio, having not had those two winners over the last 3 and 5 years. But here's one of the problems that we have, because when you're diversifying, the question is, when a share starts to run like that and becomes such a big weight in your portfolio, and you can see over a 5-year period, NVIDIA would become 41% of that portfolio. The question is, would you still stay with one share at 41% in your portfolio? Or would you go, I need to take some profits off the table? So then, is the investment return quite right? But there's another question that comes with this. Because as I started to think about this, I thought back 3 to 5 years. And the funny thing is that nobody in here was asking us about gold and NVIDIA. They were asking us about Bitcoin and Tesla. So I thought, well, that's quite interesting. Why don't we go back and do the same exercise of diversification and introduce the 3 and 5%, but I'll bring in Bitcoin and Tesla instead of NVIDIA and gold. Well, sure, over 3 years, not too bad, but jeepers, that number's come down quite considerably. And in fact, over a 5-year period, we're kind of in the same sort of areas that we were from a Harvard House point of view. And if I actually plot them, then, it's quite a different picture. And so ultimately, what you've got to remember, it's so easy, and I said a little bit earlier that history is so easy because we can look back and see what the important thing was. If we take NVIDIA as a case in point, if we go back 5 years, it's highly likely that you wouldn't have bought NVIDIA. You would have bought its competitor, AMD, which is also a chip manufacturer, because it looked like it was making much better strides versus Intel at the time. And NVIDIA was just a gamer's chip. And yet, look what it's done over the last 3 and 5 years. We can see that now, and maybe it's obvious, but it certainly wasn't obvious back then. I'm going to land this presentation by maybe going back to an example that I used in September. Michael used it in December, and I think it's relevant to illustrate a point about just what it takes to go through a cycle and hang into an investment. So you'll remember that I may have put this chart up. It's one of our core holdings in portfolio, Standard Bank. And if I go back, I went back in my presentation in September. I put this exact chart up. Going from the 1st of September 2015, when the share was trading at 142 Rand 30, and September 2025, when I did my presentation, it was trading at 247.30, a growth of 5.68% in share price relative to inflation of just 4.7%. In other words, if you had held Standard Bank and eaten every dividend that you needed because you needed it to buy petrol or food or whatever it is, then your investment still would have kept pace with inflation, but not necessarily excitingly so. If we just then looked at the dividends and said, and I did this exercise at the time, if every time I was paid a dividend by Standard Bank, I bought some more Standard Bank, then my investment would have grown just short of 12% inflation plus 7%, right on the button of what we, sort of the top end of what we're targeting, and I would have had a very healthy growth. Michael then postulated in December what Standard Bank could do if just a little bit of optimism came through, which it did. And we've by no means seen South Africa turn the corner or shoot the lights out. But certainly there's been some optimism on some of the reforms. So let's have a look, and I've just extended this to the 1st of March 2026. So it doesn't take into account, you can see the drop there. So I have included just so you can see the drop as a result of Mr. Trump's bombing. But in order to do the calculations of the annualization, I've had to go with a 1st of March as opposed to 7 days in. The share price growth over that period, if you'd eaten all the dividends, is now 7.78%. Just 6 months later. Your total return, if you'd reinvested the dividends, is 13.68%, and inflation over that full period is 4.55%. And that made me look and reminded me of a quote by Warren Buffett, which I'm going to finish with, which says, "The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out and listening to me. I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time. Nigel. Yeah, look, I mean, I think probably you can extend that question to almost to so many aspects of South Africa. Our growth rate could and should be significantly better than it is if we had political will to do stuff. And I think we live in a tension between the political will and the political handbrake, if I can use that. I mean, and I think probably a really, really good example of that is we saw that Cyril had to come out and tell our electricity minister that he was going to do the distribution company separate to the generation company because of the fight around that. And I think from a pure electricity point of view, that's the biggest question mark. It's like we've got all these plants that are being built in the Northern Cape, but we've got to get the electricity out there. So we have these problems on a widespread basis. But can I suggest to you, interestingly, I didn't do it as part of this presentation, but it was in the research that I did. This is how incredibly the world is moving. So at the moment, the cost to send a rocket into space, and that is measured by its payload. The ability to send a rocket into space is literally dropping like a stone. And so AI is driving us to the point where we can get to reusable rockets. And the ultimate thing around that is that if I can put a data center outside in orbit, I don't need water because heat is no longer a problem. And power is no longer a problem because I've got 24-hour sun, solar, feeding that. And so the cost of rockets is becoming so much cheaper that who knows whether that AI data center on the earth is even going to be sustainable in the next 10 to 15. I mean, this is how things are moving. And so this is why we've got to race for the moon again. Because now we're having a whole look at it, and space is becoming the next frontier. And none of us are even thinking about, well, you know, who's going to go and do that? Maybe with the exception of Elon Musk, who's already thinking of populating Mars. So, I mean, I think the problems with South Africa are very, very well populated, and it's this fight between political will and I don't think we can answer that question, but I would say that I would be very surprised if the guys who've put that together and are sinking the money, if they haven't done their homework, my goodness, they're going to lose a lot of money. So, you know, so ultimately, I guess it's good for us from that point of view, but the opportunities are just incredible. So thank you. Folk, thanks so much. We really appreciate that you come out. I'm sure you're hungry and thirsty. Please join us for a drink and snacks, and the team is here if you have any other questions. Thank you.